to another episode of Verbal Weekly. In the last few episodes, we dealt with reading comprehension in a variety of ways. So now I thought it's time to take up a different topic, that is vocabulary. But we're not going to be dealing with vocabulary in the usual sense of the word. We're not going to be focusing on word roots. We're not going to be dealing with lists of words. What we are going to do, however, is to explain words that you're going to encounter in your passages. So, in this particular episode, we are going to be dealing with words related to politics, but specifically political ideology. Now, in case you're wondering what is the political spectrum and why do I need to know this, well, I have an answer for you very, very soon. Let's take a look. So, as you can see, why do I need to know this? If you look at the picture here, you can clearly see that the candidate on the screen is being asked a question. Is India a pluralistic society? Now, are you likely to face a question like this? You never know. But in case you do, then how are you going to respond? Hopefully not the same way that this candidate is. So, let's get to know some of these words a little bit better. Another reason that you need to learn about these words is because of this. In the last few years, let's take a decade or so, or perhaps more than a decade, there have been multiple passages that have been political in nature. And obviously, you will be confused by some of the text if you are not familiar with these concepts. So for example, CAT 2006 talks about communism, totalitarian communist regimes, and conservative MPs. It's not that if you don't know these words, you cannot answer any of the questions. But we all know that if you have good vocabulary, you're able to read faster and your comprehension is improved. Let's take a look at another passage, a little bit more recent. So this is one from CAT 2014. Now here there is a quote. That government is best which governs least. It's a quote. Now if you know which political ideology this is associated with, all of a sudden the passage will become a lot more interesting to you. And finally, we have one from CAT 2020, pretty recent. It talks about anarchists and the political left. Now in one episode, we cannot possibly cover every term related to politics. But we are going to give you a way so that you can understand the political spectrum, at least the overall framework. Let's get started with that now. So what is the political spectrum? Well, as you can see on the screen here, it refers to the entire range of political positions or opinions that can exist. Now this is a continuum, so don't think of it as discrete ideologies which are non-overlapping. So there might be two or more points that two ideologies have in common. What you need to understand, however, is that the range is usually from the left to the right. Now on the left, we generally tend to place those people who want change. A lot of times we call these people progressives. On the right, we have the conservatives, the people who do not really want things to change. But this is a very simplistic view of looking at the political spectrum. We need to get into a few more details. So what we have done is that we have tried to figure out a framework by which you can understand political ideologies. We assess political ideologies on certain basic parameters. For example, individual rights or collective. Some political ideologies focus more on the individual and some of them focus more on the group. Now, of course, how much focus is going to be there is different for each ideology. The second parameter is pluralism versus majoritarianism. Again, this is something that we are going to talk about in a bit more detail. So let me just give you the entire list. The third parameter is market versus state. This is pretty common. I'm sure that you have heard of this. And the last parameter here is ecology versus economy. Now, ecology here refers to the environment. And this is a consciousness that has come about in the more recent times. It was not always there. So we will not be able to tag every political ideology with a view on the environment. Some of them have no views on ecology at all because they are older philosophies. But the more recent ones definitely have a perspective on whether the economy is more important or whether the environment is more important. So now let's understand each of these parameters and then we will move on to different ideologies. The first one here, individual versus collective. Is the person more important or is the group more important? There are some ideologies that say that individual rights are paramount and that nothing should get in the way of preserving individual rights. On the other hand, there are those who say that common or greater good is more important than the individual. Of course, there's no wrong or right. It's just an ideology. So you can decide which one you believe in. Let's take a look at the next parameter, pluralism versus majoritarianism. Now, what exactly is pluralism? As you can see, pluralism implies or understands that any nation consists of very different groups of people. Now, obviously, if the people are very different, they will have very different needs, and a lot of times those needs will conflict. So, what is it that is supposed to happen? All groups should have an opportunity to participate in decision making. So this, of course, is a little difficult to ensure, because how will you ensure that every group has equal say? We can't really do that. At the same time, if you believe in pluralism, you will try to work towards that angle. Now let's try to understand what majoritarianism is. First of all, it is belief in the fact that the majority should decide, not only for themselves, but for everyone. It seems like a pretty practical approach, but of course there is a drawback. The drawback here is that it may lead to marginalizing of certain communities, particularly those who are not in the majority. So of course these communities are called minorities. So again, different countries and maybe different political parties choose to operate in very different ways. Some of them may choose to believe that pluralism is important. Some of them may choose to believe that we cannot ensure pluralism, and therefore the most practical approach is to work with the majority. There is no wrong or right. It is just what you believe in. Then we have market versus state. Now this is something that most of us must be familiar with. The question here is, how much should the government interfere in economic matters? That's pretty much all that we are concerned about. So if you have a command economy orientation, then what happens is that there is supposed to be no private enterprise. In other words, individuals should not be running businesses. The other fact is that if the government is running the economy, then obviously the government is supposed to provide for each citizen according to his or her need. On the other hand, if you believe in the market economy, also called the laissez-faire approach, then what you're saying is that the government does not really need to regulate the economy, it can run on its own. Of course, we have seen that in the past this has led to problems, which is why a lot of people believe that there has to be some amount of government regulation. But on the whole, political philosophies differ as to how much control they want. Let's look at the next parameter. Now this one is a recent addition. We would not have talked about this if this show were being done, let's say 15 years earlier. But ecology versus economy is now an important concern. So some people say that we need to focus on economic growth because that is the best way to provide for humanity. And this growth needs to happen at any cost. On the other hand, some people believe that economic growth cannot be pursued indefinitely if we do not care for the environment. So let's understand that when we talk about the environment, we're not saying only protect the environment and do not try to grow. What we are trying to say is that they are interdependent. So we cannot really continue to grow unless it is sustainable, unless our environment also allows us to do so. Now that we've covered the 4 parameters, it's time for us to understand some specific political ideologies. Of course, as I said, it's not possible to cover everything under the sun, but we are going to take up quite a few. Let's get started with communism. Communism is something that most of us have heard about and studied in our school textbooks, but somehow people don't really understand what it's all about. So first of all, communism as a philosophy was outlined by a gentleman called Karl Marx and his colleague Friedrich Engels. Now, I did not know how to pronounce this name for a long time, but this is in fact the correct pronunciation, Friedrich Engels. So what they did was they published a communist manifesto in which they outlined the principles of communism. And that picture there, of course, is Karl Marx. So what does communism really want? Most importantly, communism wants to create a classless society in which all people are equal, at least with regard to their economic standards. Other than that, there should be no private property. But because of course, if people have private property, then how will we have a classless society? So if there is no private property, it means that the government owns all the means of production. So effectively, we are talking about what we refer to as a command economy. So the economy is run entirely by the government. Further on, the ideal state, this communist state, is supposed to be achieved through a violent revolution. Now, I know that it seems a little strange to talk about violent revolutions in order to achieve an ideal state, but that's exactly what was outlined in the Communist Manifesto. So, It should be achieved through a violent revolution led by the proletariat to overthrow the bourgeoisie. Now, these are two words that you should be familiar with. The proletariat refers to the working class, whereas the bourgeoisie refers to the elite, the rich people, the wealthy, the ones who own all the factors of production. So, in order to create a classless society, obviously, there has to be a revolution, because otherwise the powerful control the less powerful. Now, this seems like a pretty ideal state of affairs, but there is a problem. In communism, the citizens do not really have too much room for dissent. They cannot really criticize the government, and that is a big problem, as we have seen in some of the current communist states. So, in case you do not know what the communist states are at present, they exist in China, Cuba, North Korea, and Laos. Now, a lot of us do not really have too much information on states like North Korea, and a lot of us have not really heard of Laos. But pure communist states do not exist, because what Karl Marx outlined in the Communist Manifesto was an ideal. In reality, it operates a lot more differently. Let's move on to something similar and yet very different from communism, socialism. Now, what is the difference really? First of all, socialism also agrees that the major means of production should be owned by the government. That part is fine, but it does not believe that all means of production should be owned by the government. Now, since the government is controlling the major means of production, of course, the government will also provide goods and services. But what is the difference? The difference is that individuals can still own property. So this seems like a pretty good mix. It's not as extreme as communism, and it allows individuals some degree of freedom as well. Now, if you look at this picture, what this is telling us is that we are looking at a mixed economic model. So the citizens contribute to the economy, but the government shoulders the major burden for handling the economy. Other things that you need to know is that socialism actually believes in change through peaceful processes rather than a violent and armed revolution. And finally, there are no pure socialist states, but there are countries today with a socialist orientation. Now, you could probably do some research on your own and figure out what these countries are. Now, let's talk about a political philosophy which you might have heard of quite frequently, liberalism. When we call someone a liberal, then a lot of us are unsure of what we're really trying to say. Are we trying to insult that person? Are we trying to compliment that person? And the reason is that we don't really understand the philosophy of liberalism. So let's understand it today. One of the key characteristics of liberalism is that it emphasizes individual freedom. As a result, it sees the government as a necessary evil. The government is required, but we don't want to give it too much power. Because if the government has too much power, then it will probably try to suppress individual freedom. So why do we really need the government at all? We need the government to correct what is wrong in society, to promote equality, to correct inequalities, for example. Another thing, of course, is that it focuses a lot on the freedom of the individual to regulate the economy and trade. So, of course, it supports free markets, free trade, limited government, social equality, and fundamental rights. Now, this includes civil rights and human rights. So, again, let's understand that liberalism as a philosophy has actually changed. The classical version of this philosophy said that we don't really want government interference. The government should have a very, very limited role. Its job is to protect life, liberty, and property. That's it. But over a period of time, we have realized that the government needs to be a little more proactive in order to enhance individual freedom for everyone. So now, the liberals would favor significant government intervention, but again, in order to correct whatever is wrong in society. So, all individuals are supposed to have equal value. As a result, if there is any social or economic inequality, the government is supposed to play a role in correcting that. Now, liberals would therefore support programs to help the disadvantaged. Let's move on to neoliberalism. Now, neo obviously means a newer version of the same philosophy, but all the newer versions usually have a limited scope. So what is neoliberalism? As you can see, it has a narrower focus. It specifically is concerned with policies that influence the economy. So the neoliberals are not as concerned with social equality, for example. On the whole, we associate neoliberalism with leaders such as Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and another gentleman, Ludwig Erhard, which you may not have heard of because he is not of recent times. He used to be the German Chancellor. Nevertheless, you can do your own research. So what does neoliberalism really want? Of course, it supports free markets, that goes without saying, but it also tries to limit government spending. So please understand that the neoliberals are trying to say that the government should not really spend too much on social welfare programs. That is what limiting government spending is. It also is trying to say that the government should not really own means of production. So it would be in favor of privatization rather than public ownership of assets. The neoliberal philosophy has been under attack in recent times, particularly in the context of the pandemic. During this time, a lot of people felt that the government did need to interfere in order to protect individuals. So the neoliberal philosophy, which tries to limit government spending and limit government interference, it was not very conducive to those times. As a result, as you can see in this particular picture, people were saying that we've had enough austerity. In other words, the government needs to step in and help us out. Let's move on to something new now. Conservatism. Now this is not a new philosophy, but whenever you hear that someone is a conservative, what is it that we're really trying to say? The picture says it all. An individual is being controlled by strings. So that tells us that the conservatives do believe in controlling the individual. How do we control the individual? Through institutions and traditional practices. So the fundamental belief of the conservatives is that human beings are not too great. They are selfish, they are irrational, and in order to ensure that society continues to function, individuals need to be controlled. So without the restraining power of traditional institutions, there can be no ethical behavior. The conservative philosophy over time has also undergone change, and now we have something called neoconservatism. Now neoconservatism is actually a pretty influential philosophy in the modern world. There are several points that you need to know about it. Number one, they advocate a free market economy with minimum taxation, and they do not want too much regulation from the government. So in this case, they are very similar to the liberals, but there are huge points of difference. They want strict limits on government provided social welfare programs. So let's remember that when you are a conservative, you don't really want to fundamentally change anything. So if society is unequal, you don't really want to do too much to change the social structure, which is why it kind of follows logically that the government should not spend on social welfare programs, because that is trying to alter society in a fundamental way. The neoconservatives also surprisingly favor a strong military with a large defense budget. Now this might seem a little illogical. They don't want to spend on social welfare, but they do want to spend on defense. But it will make sense in just a bit. Just like the conservatives, the neoconservatives also believe in the value of traditional institutions, and they believe that the government policy should try to favor tradition. Another thing that is very specific to the neoconservatives is that unlike the conservatives, they want the US to play a larger role in international affairs. So let's understand that neoconservatism as a philosophy is primarily associated with the US. Now, the neoconservatives do not have too much faith in international institutions like the UN. But what they do want is that the US should try to promote democracy in other parts of the world through intervention, and perhaps even militarism if necessary. Now this particular policy came into play during the Republican administrations all the way from the 1970s to the 2000s. Now the neoconservative philosophy is actually pretty aggressive because it sees the US as one who could fix problems in the rest of the world. So this philosophy was in fact responsible for the US attack on Iraq and Afghanistan. Let's now take a look at something very, very different, libertarianism. Liberty means freedom. So libertarians want individual freedom. They want almost complete freedom for the individual. So what they're trying to say is, let's not interfere with anyone else. So the poster in fact is very relevant. They are opposed to government interference. They see the government as dangerous. Some form of government is important, but its role should be very, very limited. It should protect individual life, maybe property, law and order, but that's about it. It does, of course, support free markets because that's a part of individual freedom. Now, what is different about libertarians is this bit. They believe that we do not really need social welfare programs because these are also administered by the government. So, how do we bring about a better society? Through mutual aid, charity, and so on. So, the libertarians have a lot of faith in the individual to do good. And that is one way that they are very, very different from the conservatives. Then we have the progressives. This is also a very commonly used word, but progressivism is actually a pretty old philosophy. It emerged during the Industrial Revolution. So what we need to understand is that the Industrial Revolution brought about a lot of changes, both good and bad. One of the things that happened during that time is that there was a great deal of social inequality. If you look at some of the pictures of that time, you can clearly see that there are a lot of children working in the factories, for example. A lot of people were very poor and a lot of people became very rich. Progressivism decided that this was not the right state of affairs. So they wanted to curb the negative impact of institutions, including very large corporations. So what do the progressives actually want? They want to reduce economic inequality. This of course makes sense. But other than that, they also want to do away with any systemic discrimination, whether it is based on race or gender. So as you can see in this picture, there are people who want women to vote and who are probably in favor of any public policies that promote individual rights. So for example, they would also support environmentally conscious policies, social safety nets, workers' rights. So on the whole, the progressives do want change in favor of a more egalitarian society and perhaps a more environmentally conscious world. Finally, let's deal with these words. What do the words left and right mean in the context of politics? To put it very simply, parties that are communist or socialist in nature are said to be left-leaning. So left-leaning parties usually want change. On the whole, parties that are conservative are said to be on the right. They believe in tradition and trying not to change. So those in the middle obviously are going to be called centrists. Most political ideologies are no longer extremely left or extremely right. In fact, if you assess them on the 4 parameters that we have discussed, you will find that it's pretty mixed. But how do you understand these political ideologies better? Of course, you need to do some homework. So I'll give you an idea as to how you can start. Read about the current political climate in some very different countries. I've taken an example here of New Zealand, Sweden, USA and India. You can take other 4 countries also, but just make sure that they are very different from each other. Look at all of these countries and try to figure out what is the stand on the 4 parameters that we have discussed. And then see if you can figure out what is the dominant political ideology in each of these countries. I hope that today's session was helpful in your understanding the political spectrum. See you next time.